Welcome to the 6th video of the World History series. The 7th video is going to be very entertaining, but the 6th one is also great. And in the 7th, the Mongols are coming from the outer lane. So far, we have reached the year 1000 in the first 5 videos. Where are we? What was the state of the world in the year 1000? First, let me show you the map. The state of the world in the year 1000 is as you see on the screen now. When we look at the world in the year 1000, we cannot speak of much settlement in America. There are only small settlements. But the main story is unfolding in Asia and Europe. People are still reluctant to venture too far north due to the cold. Of course, there are people living here, as well as principalities, etc. But the main story, the story we look at as history, will unfold in Europe and Asia. If you take a look at Europe, the Islamic world is rapidly spreading into Europe in 2 or even 3 parts through Africa. There is a caliphate here. Here, the Umayyads and Abbasids are 2 separate entities. In this context, in 1071, the Seljuks will enter Anatolia by defeating Armenia. The Ghaznavids are also present. And when you look at the rest of the map, there are actually small states. The Arabs are here. This is how the situation in China seems from afar. I will also mention, in narrating this history, Japan is truly becoming an aging society. Although China is richer than them, it is still not as powerful and large as it is today. We will cover the period between the year 1000 and 1200. When you reach the 1000s, something can be said more comfortably about Europe. 90% of the population are voluntary slaves, or slaves, in the sense that they work the land themselves but do not earn anything from it. I'm saying this for Europe. 10% of the population controls everything, and they are monopolizing all the money. On the Chinese side, there are rises in China and Japan. If you remember from the last video, we had shown the rise of Islam starting from the 600s. Between 1000 and 1200, we will see the Islamic world becoming more organized and transforming into an empire, as well as the relationship and conversations between the Arabs and the Chinese. But first, we will start with China. During this period, China had settled and become an empire. Compared to Europe, they make agriculture twice as efficient. We see the Tang dynasty between the years 700, 800, 900. But by the year 900, this state will be divided between the Liao state and the Song dynasty. It's about the structure of China. The Song dynasty and the Liao state will engage in significant warfare, and there will even be marriage exchanges between the Liao and Song. However, for China to grow further, it will need to free itself from both of these families. Especially rice, which is a bit harder to grow in Europe. Rice is a major food source for China. I will explain more shortly. They are also quite good in textiles, such as silk. Let me make a comparison. In agriculture, the yields are twice as high compared to Europe, but, for example, a cow in China, I apologize for making this comparison, produces 6 times more milk than an English cow. This is because it is better fed. In Europe, the period between 1000 and 1200 was marked by scarcity and poor health conditions. The cows in the far east of China produce 6 times more milk, while they also yield 3 times more meat compared to their English counterparts. In other words, they can gain weight. Therefore, the Chinese are better nourished, while the Europeans are worse nourished. During this period, we will also see various diseases such as malaria in Europe. In Japan, hemp is very common. Don't think of this solely in terms of drug logic. The Japanese make everything from hemp. They make their clothes from hemp and build their houses from hemp. They are feeding on hemp and so on. Various aspects of Japanese culture are based on hemp. The Japanese are poorer compared to the Chinese. Now that we are comparing with the Chinese, let's compare the Chinese with the Islamic world. Also Europe in terms of hygiene. There was a huge urban legend. The Turks were like this. Europe was like that. The streets, China. An incredible hygiene system has been forgotten. They have even established sewage systems to remove the waste of animals and humans away from the city. The removal of solid waste and human excrement from the city is very important. The Chinese had this system 2200 years ago. Notice that waste is removed from the houses and transported to the main lines, and then carried out of the city through these pipes. Let me show you some examples right away. Look, the pipes from the Chinese dynasty 2200 years ago were not made of concrete, of course, but they were transporting water outside the city, one way or another. Sewage pipes from 2000 years ago, and how they were removed after exiting the entire city. The Islamic world is not yet at that point, but in this century we will see Hassan Sabah, who will establish the Alamut Castle. He is establishing a screw system to bring water up to the Alamut Castle and has an incredible engineer. I watched his documentary on National Geographic. Hassan Sabah is correct. I am not falling into errors. Hassan Sabah, who founded the Assassins, knows very well how to wash in the baths of the Islamic world during this period. So they are trying to remove the filth, and they do that with what they call soil, but unfortunately, hygiene in Europe is not that great either. People are not very healthy either. Human waste is also found on the streets. In other words, they have not yet devised a sewage system. During this period, Europeans are very hungry. They are subsisting on porridge. They are fed with highly diluted soup and bread. In fact, the church is managing this by saying that it is more virtuous to be nourished with bread and so on to prevent any uprisings in the Far East and the Islamic world. The involvement of India, along with the strengthening of the Silk Road during this period, means that spices are also present. They are cooking with meat and using spices. Now, this significantly changes their way of life. Today, when you look at Scandinavia, during that period, the average life expectancy was 18 years. See, the average life expectancy was 18 years. People who reach the age of 34 are considered wise individuals. In the European bloc, that's why it was like this in the 1000s, in the 1200s, and it was the same in the 800s. In Europe, figures like Aristotle and Da Vinci are considered successful masters at a very young age. This is because life is short. In other words, being 80 today is equivalent to being 40 back then. Let me give you an example that I will elaborate on much further ahead. There is a successful study from the 1850s. They say that if a child lives to see the age of 42, it is a very good life. For men, it was also 39-40. Just think, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, if someone lived to be 40, they would say, well, that's it, their life is complete. Human lifespan has greatly increased. Of course, the availability of medicines and the comfort provided by technology, along with the absence of wars, contribute to this balance. But it was hunger and health issues. The religious year was a time when Europe was in filth and famine, while the East, due to the Silk Road and the peace between the Chinese and the Arabs, experienced a period where they were somewhat better nourished. As I mentioned, in the Far East, the Islamic world was doing relatively well due to the Silk Road. But, especially towards the end of the years 1000 to 1200, something interesting happened around the 1100s, particularly in the 1150s. These spices are transforming European cuisine. At the same time, in the early 1st century AD, sugarcane was being cultivated in China and then spread to Iran. This process took about 1,000 years, reaching Europe through Cyprus by the 10th century. Europeans are crazy about sugar. But there is a problem. Despite coming from sugarcane, it causes various health issues. And it's not even today's glucose syrup or anything like that. The Queen of England consumed so much sugar in the 14th century that all her teeth fall out. So this could certainly be an exaggeration of English history, but the Queen has everything sweetened. The only thing that competes with sugar is cotton. Cotton is also thriving in the Islamic world. Therefore, trade with China is very good. Spices, cotton, and silk, along with sugar, significantly strengthen the Silk Road between China and the Islamic world. The problem is this. During that period, a center is forming for the spread across the entire world. It is located between the East and the West. This place is Baghdad. Baghdad was 6 times larger than Constantinople, which is also referred to as Istanbul during that period. It was a bigger place, a center. Therefore, the center of the world was Baghdad. Its population was 900,000, while at that time, the largest towns and city centers in England had populations of only 20,000 to 30,000. Think of it that way. In Europe, populations of 50,000 to 60,000 are large. Baghdad is enormous. 900,000? Exaggerating? The world population is 265 million. Baghdad, with a population of 1 million, is significant. Imagine that. India has 80 million, China has 65 million, and the rest of Asia has 40 million. Today, places that have billions were at that time in the range of 100 million or 80 million. When you look at all of Europe, there is a population of 35 million. This is why the Mongols were so successful, as they migrated from Central Asia. The population in Europe is very low, and we are in a period where France has a population of 6 million and Germany has a population of 3 million. During this period, slavery was very common. Soon, I will also tell you about the Ghaznavids and Sedat's account of the Ayyubids, so don't worry, we will discuss the wars as well. But for now, let's take a general look at this period. Slavery was very prevalent during this time. There are three types of slaves. There are slaves coming from Eastern and Central Europe. They are obtained from here. There are also slaves coming from the Far East and slaves coming from Africa. All of these slaves are being castrated somewhere. There are castration centers. They are distributed to the world from there. Thus, the villages coming from Central Asia are castrated in Samarkand and Bukhara, distributed globally. The villages collected from Europe are castrated in Verno, France, and distributed as well. What are slaves used for? Now, producing sugarcane and rice is a very unhealthy job. Most slaves are already dying from malaria because you are in the water. I don't know if you've seen a rice paddy. It is very unhealthy, very humid. You are surrounded by water. Slaves are used here in the first stage. The second dangerous job is in the mines. Here, aging and useless slaves, or those who are excessively beautiful, are used in the household. They are employed in domestic service. But slavery is immense. The slavery we will see later in America in the 1500s, in the 16th century, and in the 17th century is nothing compared to this. Do you know what slaves were used for here, especially in Europe? Let me give you a very brutal example. They were used to make swords. They need to cool the swords. The ideal temperature for cooling that steel is achieved by inserting it into a slave's abdomen. In other words, they can cool about 10 swords with one slave. They say that they have already discarded the slave and so on. There were such savage times. There was a period when they used slaves instead of oil to quench the steel. Since it's going to end anyway, let's just say it. I won't bore you with terrible things now. Although in world history, the Mongols are at 7. There's nothing more terrifying. In the 7th century, China was very powerful. Because there is a product in hand, which is silk, that is immensely powerful. The problem is that one of the monks first smuggles silkworms into the Islamic world and then to Europe. He teaches the world how to produce silkworms and, more importantly, how to produce silk. The Arabs also produce silk, and Europe produces silk as well. However, of course, the quality remains high due to factors like the mulberry leaves they feed on, the conditions of their diet, and the climate. During this period, Europe is trying to sell as many goods as possible in the Islamic world. He is trying to sell a little olive oil, wine, fish, leather, and wool. The Islamic world does not have much need for these. What can Uni do? The Arabs are already boiling. You know that they do not prefer alcohol very much. Europe's barter power is not very high. Therefore, the Arab world is trading more towards the West and the East. If you think that the Silk Road only carries money and goods, you are mistaken. Why? The Silk Road carries two more things. 1. Intelligence and map information. The Chinese are constantly learning things from the Arabs, such as the map and what lies further to the west. Secondly, there is bilateral science and technology, including the production of gunpowder and paper. Many things carried technology along the Silk Road. Much like fairs, just as the internet spreads information today, it was similar in that era. As a general note, during this period, Jews do not face many issues with Muslims, and although Christians do not favor them much, Jews are becoming very powerful in trade within the Islamic world. In Europe, Venice and the Italians control all trade because it is a port city. The merchants of Venice are very wealthy during that period. Although Venice is not as significant today, we can say it was the capital of trade during that period. Specifically around the year 1001, when Mahmud of Ghazni and the Ghaznavids were prominent, Mahmud of Ghazni sets his sights on India and wins a battle in Peshawar in 1001. He then makes his entry into India, entering the Indus Valley. It enters Iran and Afghanistan. The Ghaznavids are a major power during this period. Between 1200, the Ghaznavids pose a threat to everyone. When the year 995 passes, the Karakhanids emerge. The Ghaznavids are also present, as you can see. Until the year 1150, the Ghaznavids will not grow much, but their neighbors on the left will change, and the Seljuks will come, just like that. You can see the rise of the Seljuks right now. We will explain this shortly. Just look at the Ghaznavids at the moment. The Seljuks are taking land from the Ghaznavids. The Karakhanids are holding their ground as much as possible. The year is currently 1050, moving towards 1080. We are in the year when the Ghaznavids are still in the same place. As we enter the year 1100, While the land of the Dark Ones is divided in two, the Ghaznavids are still found in the same territories. By the year 1150, the Ghaznavids were fading from the stage of history. An interesting event occurs in 1200. Leif Erikson, the son of Red Eric, is said to have traveled to America as a Viking. There are many tales about his expedition, some claiming he set out and never returned, but ultimately he discovers America. In fact, it is later called Vinland or Newfoundland because it is a place with a lot of grapes. Think of wine, grapes, and the like. This is how it is named. He spends 3 winters here but cannot settle. In this video, we will now see the Seljuks. I am speaking about Central Asia. The Oghuz people live between the Caspian Sea to the east and the Aral Sea. These Oghuz consist of 24 different tribes. Their rulers are called Yabgu. Yabgu is thought of as a king, sovereign, or sultan. That is why they are referred to as the Oghuz Yabgu state in history. There are 24 tribes associated with these Oghuz. One of them is the Kunuk. We can say that the Seljuks are descended from these Kunuk people. These Seljuks will lay the foundations of the Ottoman Empire, or rather, the foundations for the entry of Turks into Anatolia. There is the assistant of the commander-in-chief of the Oghuz Yabgu state, Dukak Bey, a very heroic man. He is dying and his son takes his place. Now we begin here, Selçuk Bey. Selçuk Bey is initially very loyal to the Oghuz Yabgu state and is also the assistant to the commander-in-chief. But then, whatever happens, they fall out with Yagbu, their leader, and leave with their family. They seek a place for themselves within the Islamic world. It is not the Oghuz who encounter Islam during this period. When Selçuk Bey arrived and settled in the Hell Plain, he noticed that there were Muslims in the area and did not want to have any issues with them, so he converted to Islam. Therefore, this place is shown as the point where the Turks encountered Islam. There are 3 more discussions on this topic, but Selçuk Bey's encounter with Islam is referred to as the integration of Turks with Islam. After choosing Islam, Selçuk Bey behaves more harshly towards the Oghuz, and he is expanding his territories. He is gathering soldiers behind him, and he is growing. Unfortunately, while expanding his map, he does not live long enough. He passes away in 1007. Their grandchildren and sons are spreading more in the region. Looking at the 11th century, there are the Samanians, Ghaznavids, and Karakhanids in the region. After Selçuk Bey, the Karakoyunlu exert some pressure, and in this region, the Beys Tugrul and Chagri, who are central to the Sent region, begin to diverge. They are advancing towards Samarkand and Bukhara. They are trying to take control of Samarkand for themselves. In 1040, the Battle of Dandanakan occurs. The Ghaznavids are defeated. Tugril Bey and Chagri Bey are becoming even stronger. Shortly after, Baghdad is captured. Thus, the Seljuks' capture of Baghdad begins to strengthen the Seljuk state. Tughril Bey dies in 1063. His son Alparslan takes his place, and after winning the Battle of Manzikert against the Byzantines in 1071, he comes to Anatolia. This is what we have always been told about 1071. Within 6 years, it rapidly advances into the interior of Anatolia until 1077. During this period, the Seljuks saw the emergence of Omar Khayyam. Omar Khayyam wrote immense books and remarkable works. He composed Rubaiyat, and I found the latest news about him from the BBC. Considered the most magnificent book in the world, it is adorned with gold, jewelry, precious stones, and is produced by a highly competitive company, both in terms of its content and its presentation. Such a work is left behind. There is not much movement in Africa during this period. A tribe speaking the Bantu language emerges in Nigeria and quickly spreads northward and eastward. These Bantus will later disappear. The main story revolves within the Islamic world. We are looking at this period around 1200 from the perspective of the Islamic world. In 1090, Hassan Sabah emerges. I had read about Hassan Sabah's life. I also read about the Alamut Castle. It is an interesting book. It takes a branch from the Shiites and establishes the Assassins, Hashashin sect, with them. According to the Book of Alamut, the Hashashin order produces its own devoted assassins. In 1095, a group of French nobles and clergy in Clermont said that our holy lands are being defiled by filthy Muslims and so on. The Pope then comes forward and places the cross, stating that we unite for the sake of the cross. Here we have the Franks. And actually, we cannot separate the French and Germans very distinctly when we look at the history of France. But, in summary, they come together for the First Crusade. Within 2 years, in 1097, the Crusade begins. The first place they attack is Nicaea, which is under the control of the Seljuks. Afterwards, they take Urfa and Antioch from the Seljuks. They advance even further, reaching Jerusalem. So, are the Seljuks really fighting that poorly? No. For example, the Seljuks have 75,000 soldiers for the siege of Antioch, defending the castle. There are 15,000 Crusaders coming from the road. A force 5 times larger would normally win the battle, but 2 traitors inside open the gates of the fortress to 15,000 people, and unfortunately, Antioch falls. Of course, the Islamic world was very chaotic during this period. You will see that between 1000 and 1200, the involvement of Muslims benefited the Europeans significantly during the First Crusade, but the situation reversed during the Second Crusade. As the Europeans became entangled within their own conflicts, Islam began to rise again. The Ottoman Empire rose during a time when Europe was very tumultuous. The success of the Crusades did not turn out to be very beneficial for Europe. This is one of the factors that sabotaged the Second Crusade. The Pope said, "Wow, I called the army. Did you see how powerful I am?" He starts to put the emperors in their place one by one. And for example, the 4th one goes against the Pope, and the Pope has him deposed. Between the years 1000 and 1200, you will see that both the Italians and European states engage in many wars with the Pope. Today, the Vatican is a state on its own within Italy. The Vatican is so powerful, the knights who went to Jerusalem at the end of the Crusades, they stayed there. In 1119, these knights say that there are now pilgrims coming from Europe to this place after traveling such a long distance. Let us establish a culture to protect these. They come together and form a sect. This is how the Rose Cross Order, which is the subject of Dan Brown's books, and the Knights Templar emerge. At that time, the King of Jerusalem said, "There is an ancient temple here. Take the area where that hill is and make it your center." They also make it a center for the Knights Templar because they consider themselves to be knights, thus earning the name of Templar Knights. It is not the same. During this period, the world's first university is being established in Bologna. The foundations that would later enable the University of Bologna and Europe to make significant advancements in knowledge and scholarship were laid during this period. There is an event you should know about. During this period, the Arabs unknowingly played a significant role in the transfer of world culture. Euclid's book on geometry is, for example, a very significant work. It is being translated into Arabic. Now the Arabs are incorporating this into their culture. And since the Arabs traveled all the way from Africa to Spain, specifically to Seville, this knowledge of geometry is continuously advancing there in Seville. As Arab and European cultures intertwine, take those works and translate them into Latin. In other words, if Euclidean can still be transmitted today and can be read in the present if such a culture exists, it is thanks to the Arabs updating and translating knowledge into a common language. The Pope sees that his situation is tight and that he needs another victory. He says that the Eastern Roman Church will fall, so let's strike the Muslims once more, meaning don't bother with me. Let's come together and attack the people. The Second Crusade is declared. 20,000 German soldiers and 15,000 French soldiers enter. The English join. Everyone is participating in this campaign. They are marching towards Anatolia. In 1144, there is chaos in Anatolia. When this army is in disarray, they seek to achieve a victory. The Pope insists, saying they should at least capture a place. They attack Damascus, the only Muslim state supporting the Christians. However, they are unable to take Damascus as well. Thus, all the reputation they gained during the First Crusade and all the infamy they spread against the Islamic world are nullified as a credit in the Second. In other words, if the Second Crusade had never taken place, perhaps Europe would have collapsed into the Islamic world much earlier. Fortunately, the Second Crusade fails. Between 1150 and 1200, there is a lot of infighting among the Germans, including the French. And with the Pope, 1176, 1002, a significant name emerges in the Islamic world, Saladin, who conquered Egypt. Saladin achieved many conquests. They capture Jerusalem last. When they take Jerusalem, Europe declares the Third Crusade. We are already in the 1200s now. Around 1189, the Third Crusade begins. They are entering Anatolia. They encounter Saladin. We are talking about armies of 20,000 to 30,000 men. Frederick Barbarossa is being defeated here. His army is falling apart, and Saladin is achieving a great victory within the army. This time, a significant rise of Islam in the world is beginning, particularly among the French and the English. Saladin is continuously capturing Acre, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and so on. This success will frighten the Pope. The Fourth Crusade will begin. But that is the subject of another video, the 1200s. Here, we need to understand this. If the Mongols had not emerged, the situation would have been very different. The hero of the next video is the Mongols. It was a great threat to the world, to everyone. I hope you enjoy the world history series. In the next video, we will meet the Mongols. The previous video was about the birth of Islam, and in this video, we will discuss the rise of Islam. Now it's time for the Mongols. I am Haluk Tatar. See you in the next world history.